Started recording.
Present online. Current slide. Okay, let's see if we can get all this working the way it should. All right. Start slideshow. Well, okay, we're just about there. There we go. Okay. Okay. Let me just do one last thing and we're ready to go, but in the middle while I'm bringing up the other computer. For those of you who aren't here, I have put a great number of maps out, which I think will help visualize the extent of this particular operation that's going to take up most of the lecture today. And the importance of this is that, as I talked about last time in finishing up the lectures that had to do with Coral Sea and Midway, I emphasized that this coming operation is the first real offensive operation the United States takes in the World War II in the Pacific. The Coral Sea and Midway were really defensive actions. We were responding to the initiatives the Japanese had at that point. I also contended a bit that in most historians' views, and I think with justification, Midway was seen as what's called the turning point in the Pacific. The Japanese lost 4 carriers. We lost 1. This is interesting. It says unmute myself, but you all can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And you in audience land can hear me.
Right,
So I'm not going to do that.
Right.
I show this picture because at the Battle of Midway, the Yorktown took some hits from the Hiryu. This was the counterstrike by the only surviving carrier of the Japanese. And then subsequently, the American aircraft found the Hiryu, damaged her. And I think this picture shows the kind of damage that's inflicted by bomb hits, but also the resilient nature of aircraft carriers at the time. The amount of damage they could take and still remain afloat was sometimes pretty extraordinary. And as another example, the Makuma, one of the heavy cruisers the Japanese had cooperating with the carriers, happened to be twisting and turning to try to avoid bomb strikes and collided with the Megami. Afterward, she was caught by American aircraft and again pummeled. The thing that's rather amazing again is here's this ship that's still upright with many crew that you'll see out at the bow and near the stern. And on top of all of that, they're still afloat. It's really pretty extraordinary. And it has to do a great deal with how ships were constructed at the time. In any case, I labeled this coming portion as turning point in the Pacific, not so much because Midway itself was the turning point, though legitimately one can say that because of the loss of 4 Japanese carriers, and because after Midway, the Japanese went on the defensive, it truly is a turning point. I tend to use the following campaign, the Guadalcanal Campaign, is a more central feature because it represents, as I said a little earlier, the first offensive action on the part of the United States. And this was a brutal campaign that really kind of went back and forth for nearly 6 months. And we're going to spend some time going over that, not just because I find the details interesting, because I think it underscores a little bit of what I had said, that even though the Japanese lost 4 carriers, they were hardly willing at this point to believe that they were actually going to lose the war. The loss of 4 carriers and the associated aircraft and pilots and the rest that they did lose at Midway certainly had a profound effect. But they were not finished as far as they were concerned. So when you think about a turning point and what constitutes a turning point, is it the attitude of one side saying, we believe this is a turning point and now we're going to win? In a way, we almost thought we were going to win regardless, almost from Pearl Harbor. Because once you mobilize the entire economy and the American people, you could say that the real turning point of the war was Yamamoto's attack on Pearl Harbor, which, as I said back in earlier lectures, in some ways was a strategic disaster. Now, Yamamoto was responsible for both Coral Sea and for Midway. So think about how many historians and those of us who've studied a good deal of the Pacific War have come to believe Yamamoto as a brilliant man. He was certainly operationally brilliant and tactically maybe less so. Strategically, my view is that that's where his greatest deficiency showed up, that he made the wrong strategic decisions. And that comes true with the Battle of Guadalcanal. And I'll set that up for you in a moment, just as I have to upload one piece of data and then we'll go on from there. Now, why Guadalcanal is a turning point? Because it was only after Guadalcanal that I think the Japanese began to understand that they weren't going to win the war. And I'll come to that in some commentary as we finish this up. Let me just get this text up that I want to have as part of the narrative. In other words, the Japanese, even after Midway, in spite of not letting the government, and particularly the Japanese army, know the degree to which they had been beaten at Midway, the attitude of the Japanese on the whole was not, we have been beaten, we're going to lose. At that point, it still was questionable from their perspective. And it's an important one to keep in mind because the end of Guadalcanal sets up a different mindset for the Japanese. All right. When I was speaking about the Coral Sea prior to Midway, the Japanese had sent down a seaplane tender and put up a seaplane base at Tulagi, which was across the Sea Lark Channel, as you can see on those maps, from Guadalcanal. Here's Florida Island that you can see down in the corner. And can we turn these lights off here?
Sure.
Maybe? Yeah. And at this point, the Japanese also thought that it would be useful to put an airfield on Guadalcanal. Why? Because this gave them the possibility with their long-range patrol aircraft to be able to identify, to fly over. Gosh, this just gets ridiculous after all. Sorry about this, folks. They could identify American transports and they could cover the supply lines that were coming from the States to Australia. Remember that because of the things that happened in early 42, in those first few months, the British and the Dutch were thrown out of the entire southwest portion of the Pacific and had lost control over nearly all of the archipelago of Indonesia, Malaya, and so on. What the Japanese felt they could do by interdicting the supply lines from the United States to Australia was lessen the possibility, not necessarily completely eliminated, but lessen the possibility of an offensive against their southern flank. And it's best demonstrated in one of the maps over there on the table on the far left. When you begin to see the global picture, the Pacific picture in its entirety. In this situation, therefore, the initial intent by the Japanese on Guadalcanal was not to make this necessarily a major airbase. It was to be a subsidiary. The major bases were Rabaul and Truk, which were further to the northwest from Guadalcanal. So here's Guadalcanal. Rabaul is up here and Truk is off in this direction. The Coral Sea Initiative had been to try to capture Port Moresby because by holding this and holding this, you would have great coverage of the Coral Sea and most of the approaches to the eastern Australian coastline. However, the United States saw this as a major threat and therefore had to respond. So keep in mind that right at the beginning, the Japanese had not seen Guadalcanal as a great strategic import. It was useful. Remember, they wanted to build a powerful perimeter against which the American Navy would be damaged and then defeated and force us to view a prolonged war as unacceptable and therefore grant to Japan certain autonomy in East Asia, Malaya, and so on. However, Guadalcanal was not actually part of that initial perimeter. It became an extension, particularly as a result of the Doolittle raid. Remember, as we talked about that last time, it was never expected that a B-25 would launch from a carrier. It had to come from a land base. That meant that you had to push the perimeter further out so that the range of a B-25 or any subsequent bomber, because the Japanese knew we had B-17s, that was no secret. They captured some in the Philippines. They destroyed a bunch and they found the remnants and said, oh, look what we got. So they pushed the perimeter out further in order to grant themselves that extra protection. But still, Guadalcanal was not to be a big base. Therefore, they allocated limited resources to it. And it took them a good while, months actually, to appreciate that the United States was seeing this as a real foothold from which further offensives could be launched. So now the initiatives were beginning to change. The Japanese had the initiative up through Midway. They'd actually had the initiative of sorts when they wanted to take and put an airfield on Guadalcanal. But now the initiatives were shifting because the United States was making a much bigger commitment. Now, through July, and remember that this first offensive from the United States perspective takes place on August 7th. So this is a month, almost 2 months after Midway. The United States realizes the threat that an airfield on Guadalcanal proposes, and therefore they're going to construct a response to it. The response was called Operation Watchtower under General Vandegrift and was to bring together Marines in order to land on Guadalcanal, seize control of the airfield, and establish a more permanent base. Vandegrift had very little information about Guadalcanal itself. In addition, the Marines were scattered to a number of bases, and he had to try to bring them together so they could practice an invasion and coordinate the various naval forces that would be there in support and supply. And this became a very complex operation with very little time actually taken in order to do the planning. And as a result, it was often called Operation Shoestring, because it was though a lot had to just be created on the fly and there had to be a great deal of innovation. Let me just close this one. There we go. Indeed, things were so bad that in one of the transports bringing Marines to New Zealand, from which they were going to begin to consolidate their forces and then organize the invasion of Guadalcanal, on an average, the Marines on board that transport lost 20 pounds because the food was so bad and the transit was so difficult. So it's just an example of the physical demands that occurred even before the landings actually took place. Now, the organization of the landings was very important and involved several task forces that had to be brought together to cooperate over a considerable distance. If you look again at the map and you just kind of measure out how many miles things had to travel in order to show up at the same place at the same time, and then coordinate the proper timetable for landings, you began to appreciate the great difficulties that were encountered and how things could easily go wrong, as they did, with some fortunate changes on the part of the United States as they landed. So let me just, for a moment, take us through some of the things. There was a carrier task force put together. Remember, Yorktown is sunk. So what you've got is the Hornet and the Wasp left. You have two carriers. The Saratoga is not available yet. Okay. So in terms of approach, the Saratoga may be coming, but you've only got two carriers available. The Japanese still have more carriers than the United States. So this is not an equal fight in terms of just number of carriers. What is important, however, is that the American carriers carry more planes. But as I talked about during Midway and Coral Sea, the American planes are shorter range. In addition, think now of Midway, the Japanese have an airfield. Fortunately for the United States, and one of the reasons this operation occurred when it did was the airfield was not quite ready. So the Japanese could not base aircraft on it. If we delayed too long, the Japanese would be able to land aircraft on Guadalcanal, and the results could be catastrophic for any naval fleet that's trying to engage. So that was one of the reasons this time was chosen. Now, as I've talked over lectures and lectures and lectures, why the fight occurred where it did and when it occurred all have to be thought of as part of the context of this situation. Did they have other choices? Could they have gone somewhere else? What about other actions that were occurring, and so on and so forth? You can see how this came together. In this regard, you had transports. The transports bringing men and equipment and supplies that are going to be necessary. Unfortunately, due to the time constraints, only about 50% of the supplies that would normally have been necessary to sustain a force on an island like Guadalcanal with a number of troops that were intended, roughly around 20,000. If you look at that, they had only 50% of the supplies. In addition, unfortunately, the supplies were not always what is called combat loaded. In other words, the stuff you need immediately you have at the front of the ship, and the other stuff comes after, once you've sort of made your way. It was kind of just piled up, not quite too chaotically, but certainly not with the creativity and organization that you'll see in later amphibious operations. They run a rehearsal, which is a disaster. And the only good news there is, like people say, a bad rehearsal sometimes precedes a very good performance. And those of you who've been in acting can understand that. But here it's life and death. It was estimated that there were 5,000 Japanese on Guadalcanal. But in addition, it was known there was the seaplane base at Tulagi, and there were Japanese garrisons on Tulagi, Gavuto, Tanambogo, and perhaps some on the southern coast of Florida. if you look at this particular map, you'll see that Gavuto, Tanambogo, and Tulagi are actually separate islands off Florida. There were a couple of settlements the British had put there long ago when they were occupying this area. But these were not heavily garrisoned, and Florida Island was too rugged to really support an air base, a land thing. Whereas the coast of Guadalcanal, not as evident on this particular map, but you'll see it on some of the maps I've provided, has some flat coastal plain which could be used, but it was still very limited. Accompanying the transport was a surface fleet. You needed to have the surface ships there to protect the transports from submarines and from surface attack. So the coordination of these various fleets all had to be brought together in a particular time frame and then distributed to their particular areas from which they were going to conduct their amphibious landings with proper protection. The surface fleet was under the British Admiral Crutchley, and he has some things that he'll have to answer for later on. The initial landings, therefore, as you can see, there's two task forces that split around Savo Island. This divided the Sea Lark Channel approach. And the Americans intended to land very close to the airstrip, but they also had to take these areas that are at Guadalcanal. In charge of the Japanese in this particular location is Admiral Mikawa, who's based primarily at Rabaul. And I already alluded to Crutchley, who's in charge of the surface fleet that's going to protect the transports. When the Americans land, and I'll go back to this particular situation here, landing on Guadalcanal turns out to be mostly unopposed. Crutchley's ships come in, they separate into two groups to protect each of the transports going to the Florida Island region and to Guadalcanal. They shell the beaches to push the defenders down, pin them down, prevent them from reacting, and then the amphibious troops are landed. On Guadalcanal, basically the Japanese and their Korean laborers just ran for the hills. They weren't going to stand and fight at this particular time. So the Americans, in coming ashore, very quickly reached their first couple phase lines. Now, they did have an intent to reach right down here. You'll see Mount Austin, which is a number of miles inland and, unfortunately, through very rugged terrain. The Americans didn't get that far until much, much later. Instead, they milled around a good bit, were able to finally reach Henderson Field and at least set up a perimeter while supplies began to pile up on the beach. Why? Because they didn't have enough laborers and the organization was poor. The supplies coming off were not only what they needed at the time. What about at Gavuto and Tanambogo and Tulagi? These were very rugged islands. And the Japanese fought hard, even though it was very clear that they were not going to survive. At least they had nothing to look forward to. And in terms of that, I just want to very quickly look at this and see if I can give you some idea of the losses that took place. Basically, on Tulagi, I think there were 3 Japanese captured. And the rest, somewhere around 400, were basically killed. The Americans lost about 100. Now, in terms of casualties, again, it's important to sort of keep a perspective on this. We'd already lost about 2,500 dead in total of 3,000 plus at Pearl Harbor. We had lost a large number of the Philippines, one of the biggest surrenders in American history. The biggest one was actually at the Battle of the Bulge in '44. But we had lost substantial numbers So we were beginning to understand that in a war like this, maybe losing 100 killed in a day was tragic, but not enough to thwart us from occupying ground and being on the offensive. But in the context, again, I always try to bring these similarities up. Think about what was happening on the Eastern Front, where within 6 months, the Russians lost upwards of 5 million. With one battle of encirclement, about 650,000 over just a period of weeks. So by comparison, we could say that the Americans are really just getting a bloody finger rather than a limb chopped off. But the fewer casualties you have, in one sense, the more poignant they are, because it's easier to pick out all those names from a list of 100 than it is to pick it out from a list of 600,000. So Americans always paid very close attention to casualties. We're very much emotionally engaged with those casualties. And that's not to say that they weren't emotionally engaged elsewhere. I'm just trying to give a perspective on the way Americans fought. So we were much more inclined to use firepower to inflict damage on the enemy. We were willing to expend a lot of material, and we were willing to go to great lengths to try to prevent any deaths. Whereas in other situations, particularly on the Eastern Front, and particularly from the standpoint of the Japanese, as we'll see, think about this psychologically and how it affects the people who are involved in this fighting. The loss of life was not perceived anywhere near similarly. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt those at home, that they didn't grieve, that they didn't find the loss tragic for themselves. But there was indeed a very distinct change in the nature of the fighting that occurred, especially with the beginning of Guadalcanal, that affected the American psyche and how we were going to fight the Japanese. I alluded to this a while back, but if you think about it in this perspective, the way we fought the Germans was still heavily involved with materiel. But the treatment of German prisoners and the way in which the two sides engaged each other was often very, very different, with few exceptions, from the way we ended up fighting the Japanese. And for Americans on Guadalcanal, this was one of the first instances in which we confronted an enemy whose attitudes and behavior were very distinctly different from ours. And as a result, we engaged with them in ways that are very different from the way we engage with the Germans. Now, the landings went off pretty well. So as I mentioned, there were a considerable number of casualties that occurred on both Tulagi and Gavutu and Tanambogo. Basically, we had to wipe out the Japanese there. They just weren't inclined to surrender. And fortunately, on Florida Island, the Japanese had just withdrawn into the jungle. Eventually, they may have gotten picked up and taken home, but that was never a consideration. Now the Japanese needed to respond to us. So the initiative again is beginning to shift. And as I mentioned, Mikawa and Crutchley are the two critical people involved here. Mikawa put together a surface fleet, which is to come down and attack the landing forces at Guadalcanal. And when he comes down, his particular engagement is to come down at night. The Japanese demonstrated considerable superiority in night fighting, and they had some technological advances, particularly their torpedo called the Long Lance by the Americans, because of its great range and speed compared to American torpedoes. And it was much more effective if it hit you than was the case for many American torpedoes. And when this fight occurs at night, Even though Crutchley had put some patrol craft out to try to intercept the Japanese, and you'll see down here these two DDs, that means destroyers, right? That Macau is coming down with cruiser divisions, and he comes south of Savo Island, and he encounters much of Crutchley's surface fleet that's patrolling that area. In that engagement, the Allied force takes a pounding. I think we lost 4 cruisers. Yes, right. Canberra, Quincy, Astoria, Vincennes, and the cruiser Chicago had her bow shot off. It's an interesting example just for something to keep in mind. In terms of damage control, think of it. You're a cruiser and your bow is gone. Descriptions from people on the Chicago, watch the bow sort of go by. It's the ship is still underway because it just blew the bow right off. And yet the ship didn't sink. And that's what I wanted to show you in that other picture of the Macau that took all those damages and was still afloat. Indeed, the Chicago ended up going back to Australia backwards. They got a temporary bow put on it, made primarily out of wood, just so they could, have something to make sure it's sealed off. But then you sail it backwards, 1,000 miles. Wow. It's pretty extraordinary. Crutchley takes such a pounding that the way is open for the Japanese to hit the transports. Only Macau at that time felt he had done enough. The time it took for him, good Lord, I don't know where that came from. And the time that it took for him to engage and sink those American and British and Australian surface fleets, all used up ammunition as well. And he wasn't at all sure what remained for him to engage. So instead of attacking the transports, which could have been devastating, he turned and headed back north. Yes.
What was the status of radar on either side at that time?
Very good point. We had some rudimentary radar. The problem was that it was very bad if you had any land masses nearby. And in this particular situation, the communications also fell apart because it wasn't clear to Crutchley initially just who was coming down. Now, one would think, well, who else is coming from the north? Well, it's got to be the Japanese, right? But while it looks nice on a map, that all the ships are together and they're all, behaving themselves properly. You have stragglers, you've got all kinds of things going on. And Savo Island in itself screwed up some of the dynamics because you're now seeing something against the landmass and you're not quite sure what's what. The Japanese also launched aircraft from their cruisers. And when they flew over Guadalcanal, they dropped flares behind the American ships. So they lit them up. And that gave them targets which they could attack much more quickly than the Americans could. We did not have radar controlled gunnery. We simply had the radar to help sort of say there's something out there. So it's an excellent question. Over time, we get better, but we still screw it up. I show this slide because it just shows the Quincy on fire, and it's a photograph from one of the Japanese ships. And what you can see is the effect of searchlights, for example, which are turned on after the flares are dropped and highlighting what's going on. And also, this fighting took place at very close quarters. This is not like Jutland, where you're a good ways away and you see each other in the middle of the day and you're shelling each other. This is nighttime fighting, and some of these ships were within what would be considered, given the point blank range. So it makes it really very.
I'm watching Zoom on World War II. the Battle of Guadalcanal.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
We're
That's
we're
good.
with
It
you.
was.
I'm
So
sorry, I'm
we-
gonna mute it. She's talking to someone in her room.
Oh, okay, all right. So what you see down here in this slide at the bottom is that the American forces, out of 6 heavy cruisers, 4 are sunk, 1's damaged. This is hardly a Japanese defeat, right? So when we talk about the shifting role and importance of these engagements, it's important to keep in mind that by this particular time, August, the Japanese still have an immense naval power and they are very capable of using it effectively. Fortunately, Mikawa makes a decision which did get him criticized for not going on and attacking the transports. But at the time and in the chaos of a surface battle at night, not an unreasonable one. Now what happens? Well, the Americans say, gee, you know, we better get out of Dodge. So what happens is a lot of the transports leave because they're taking a long time to unload. And who's to say after your surface fleet has nearly been destroyed, what's going to protect you the next night? Because you're not going to be done unloading. Similarly, Admiral Turner, who was running the carriers, had seen this, his job primarily as a raid. He was to go up and cover until the transports were there and began to unload. But after that, he wanted to withdraw. He had only 2 carriers. Wasn't sure how many the Japanese would bring to bear, and the Japanese had land-based air. So he wasn't about to make a major risk of the 2 carriers that were essential to our power at this part of the Pacific Ocean. So he's going to withdraw, and with that, so are the transports and a few of the remaining surface ships that have survived this nighttime battle. So the Marines now have only about half of the supplies, which was already halved. Only about half the supplies on land unloaded by the time the transports leave. So, of course, they feel abandoned by the whole thing. In addition, the Japanese now see the particular threat, but they still haven't responded to it in a great way, other than with this surface fight, and instead bring down Japanese troops, which actually come right down through Sea Lark Channel and land to the east of the American troops, rather than to the west, which would seem to be closer to their base. They actually are that arrogant enough, they'll come right down Sea Lark Channel and they'll land in the east. And they have a particular general named Ichiki, who has a very well organized and experienced force under control. Now, more of these troops are supposed to arrive later, but Ichiki feels that under the circumstances, and not knowing how many Americans have actually landed, so very poor intelligence. Remember that the Japanese troops that were there had withdrawn into the jungle and the forest. They wanted nothing to do with this invasion fleet. He lands and he feels that he can just attack the eastern perimeter around the Henderson Field region and drive it in and kill off the Americans and reclaim Guadalcanal. Well, that doesn't go well for him. In fact, they're spotted as they're moving up to their jump off positions. The Americans get ready for them, and across what was called at the time the Tanara River and actually Alligator Creek, as you can see outlined there. And you'll see where the detachment comes in as the Japanese are trying to move along the coastal plain. They are literally destroyed. 800 out of the 900 are dead. An extraordinary one-sided victory for the Americans. The Americans had tried pushing a little bit further to the west, Lunga, but with these particular threats and limited supplies, they knew that if they used up too much combat power, they would really be in trouble. Plus, the southern exposure along the jungle is pretty much open. In other words, they can't figure out if there's anything back in the jungle region waiting for them, so they can't afford to push too far along the coastline. You have to protect this open area, and you'll notice the position of the airstrip, which is near the jungle. So you've got to establish your defensive perimeter along this kind of organization until you are assured that you're not going to be overrun. The Japanese are not done. This time they figure they'll send more troops down. The rest of Ichiki's brigade will finally arrive as well, but they're going to come down with a more powerful naval fleet with the idea that they can cover the transports that are coming down. They'll destroy anything that the Americans have brought into that region, and they'll take Guadalcanal back. So notice that this is only 2 weeks after the Americans have landed. The Americans are shuttling some supplies in, but the transports have to get there during the day and then get out, because the nighttime risk of forays from the Japanese Navy coming down and shelling the beaches and so on. But this is a concerted effort, and it occurs only 2 weeks after the landings. The Americans have brought their carriers back up, the Saratoga and the Enterprise. The Japanese have 3 carriers. And at this point, the airfield on Guadalcanal is functional, but it's not taking on yet a lot of aircraft. So it's really not a great third carrier, if you will, the way Midway was. When this fight occurs, you'll see that the Saratoga and the Enterprise, excuse me, take on the Japanese. The Saratoga escapes damage at the time, but the Enterprise is damaged and is going to have to head back to Pearl for repairs. The Japanese lose the Ruihu, which is a light carrier, not a fleet carrier. So again, this is like losing the Shoho in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the Lexington, a major fleet carrier for the Americans in Coral Sea. Shortly after, the Saratoga gets nailed by a Japanese submarine and has to return back to have repairs. And then shortly after, September 15th, now a little after a month plus after the landings, the Wasp, another major fleet carrier, is sunk by a Japanese submarine. So what do the Americans have left? They've got the damaged Yorktown, which is quickly getting repaired and will return to service in October. They have the Hornet running around, and the Saratoga is back getting fixed up. The Japanese outnumber the Americans in terms of carriers. So this is still a major issue that is often forgotten, and why I emphasize the importance of Guadalcanal compared to Midway. In October, there's yet another major battle that takes place. And in this particular situation, they're called the Battle of Cape Esperance because that's the name of this particular portion of the Guadalcanal. Again, the Japanese surface fleet come down to aid the ground troops, which they've been landing and building up in an attempt to retake Guadalcanal from the Americans. Again, they still don't appreciate how many Americans are there. And because of that, the particular fighting that goes on is imbalanced. Now, I'm going to shift for a moment, and I want to go back to the land issue between these two fights, between the Eastern Solomons and Cape Esperance. And that is one of the major Japanese attacks that's going to take place against the southern flank. And I'm going to go back up and show you here, right? The southern flank on Guadalcanal. And I have maps over here again, which help show some of the terrain and some of the issues that are involved. Some of you who've read Pacific War history or looked at the Battle of Guadalcanal will understand the word Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge. And this occurs in mid-September. So the Americans have been here for now about 5 weeks. The Marines have been struggling with poor supplies. They have been unable to advance anywhere important along the Guadalcanal coastline to try to clear the Japanese. They've been fighting primarily defensive battles. They haven't yet moved, excuse me, to the offense. And the Japanese, from their perspective, still see victory as possible for them on Guadalcanal. So again, think of the mindset issue. Americans are very defensive minding. They're trying to hold on to what they have at Henderson Field. They're trying to build the airfield so it can accept a lot of aircraft, which it does over time, becomes called the Cactus Air Force. But similarly, despite the numbers, the poor general supplies, the general conditions under which they're living, keep them from doing much other than patrolling their perimeter. They're not consolidating forces in order to launch an offensive. The Japanese, on the other hand, are still thinking offensively. And as a result, they bring together several units with the plan that they are going to attack the southern perimeter of the American force, and they're going to penetrate through, break it in half, and they're going to recapture Henderson Field. Now, when they've broken the American perimeter in half, then they have the possibility of destroying each part in detail. Now, how do they go about doing this? And again, the issues of terrain are absolutely critical. This particular map looks flat, but it isn't flat. In fact, once you get shortly off this particular edge, you begin to deal with mountains and ridges. And where you see these streams, for example, coming through, and there are many more that are not shown on this particular map, you find steep-sided gullies, and even the streams have very steep banks. So crossing these, if you're going east-west, becomes a real challenge. So even though the Japanese have landed considerable troops on Guadalcanal in order to constrain and then destroy the Americans, if they want to get to the southern flank, which doesn't provide any real north-south barrier for them to cross, they have to literally cut their way through the jungle and create new paths or tracks, which allow them to move their forces and concentrate them at their jump-off sites. Going through the jungle is not only physically demanding, but the Japanese are also finding their supplies are very limited. And because they don't have motorized transport that they can use to cut through the jungle, a lot of it has to happen by hand. And if you're pulling even a relatively lightweight artillery piece up and down these ridges, which are fairly steep, and crossing streams that have very steep banks, the physical demands are enormous. Yet they do it. And because of the way they do it in such a way that the Americans don't discover them. So the Americans don't know of the concentration that's developing in this particular area. In addition, and again, a sign of the kind of cooperation that existed, the Japanese surface fleet was to come down the slot the islands and the Solomons, as you'll see here, that open water system between the two sets of islands is called the slot. They're going to come down to Sea Lark Channel and they're going to pound the American defenses at night with surface fleets because, as I said, remember, they couldn't bring much heavy artillery to the south flank. So if you bring ships in, that's your artillery, and you can sit there and just pound the daylights out of the Americans here. And that's indeed what they try to do. As it happens, the Japanese Navy comes down, and the General Kawaguchi, who's in charge of this particular element, launches his attack against this southern flank. And when they launch this attack, the Americans hold a ridge, which is not evident on this particular map. It's actually a north-south oriented ridge. This is became called Edson's Ridge after the man who was in charge of defending it, or Bloody Ridge because of the casualties that were taken in defending it. When this attack is launched, the Japanese gain a foothold, and it looks as though they're going to be able to press their way into the American base through the perimeter and actually begin to drive right for the coast. But fortunately for the Americans, while the fighting was very intense and at times small Japanese groups broke through and got back towards the rear, the Americans were able to hold, and Edson led a particular counterattack to finally drive the Japanese back, so that by the time daylight arrived, the Japanese had been thrown back almost to their starting points. However, they weren't done yet. So they wanted yet to try again. They again made an attempt, but were clearly beaten back fairly quickly this time. And now, because supplies were so limited for the Japanese in this location, that the troops began to retreat to the west, where they had a higher concentration over in this area of troops and camps and places where they could recover. The Americans, according to the numbers I ran across, had 59 killed in action, 204 wounded. Japanese lost about 700 dead. And many of the wounded who were initially recovered would die on the way back to their camp. But again, the issue here is that the Americans were still on the defense. Still a problem in terms of what was going to happen. Supplies could be brought in, but very limited because the transports had to leave before night fell. And the Americans were still struggling with trying to consolidate their hold around the perimeter, particularly to the east and west, even though the major attack had come from the south. All right. Now, we'll take a break in a couple moments, but I just want to cover this, which I had come to. The Japanese this time, again, we're going to come down in October to again assist another land attack. On their way down, they were intercepted by the Americans, and at this particular time were turned back, fortunately, without the kind of grievous loss to the Americans that they had suffered previously. But it was again one of those confused fights. As you can see, and this is something that those of you who have looked at naval history may understand, the Americans are traveling in this particular direction while the Japanese are traveling in this direction. When the Americans cross the lead ships of the Japanese, this is known as crossing the T. And tactically, what this means is your ship firing a broadside only has to suffer return fire from the bow-oriented guns on the ships. And if the ships are in column, your ships can concentrate their fire from different angles against the oncoming ships, whereas those in column have a very restricted area of fire. So the intensity of fire that the Americans can bring into this engagement is much heavier than that can be returned by the Japanese. While the Americans were not as successful as one may have hoped, nonetheless, we were able to inflict a fair amount of damage on the Japanese and force them back. This kind of response, again, begins to show that teeter-totter effect that you're going to run into in this whole campaign in Guadalcanal. That on one side will kind of gain ascendancy for a bit, and then the other side is going to gain ascendancy for a bit. And it's going to go back and forth this way on the ground and at sea. Let's take a short break. It's getting towards 11 o'clock. Let's say 10 minutes. Yes, Judy.
Judy, one question, Mike. On these battlefields, how did the Japanese deal with their wounded and their dead?
The dead often were left where they were, because especially in places like the first battle of the Tanaru that occurred so quickly coming from the east, and in Edson's Ridge, there just wasn't a way to get the dead out. So they were left, and the Americans were the ones who ended up digging mass graves or whatever and getting rid of the bodies. The wounded, depending upon whether they were walking wounded or had to be carried, might be brought back, but because the Japanese did not have the medical support that the Americans had and had to travel longer distances under very difficult circumstances, many of the wounded simply died. Those that managed to survive and get back to the encampments might eventually get home when transports were bringing in reinforcements, and then they could put the wounded back on. The other part that was devastating to both sides was that sickness was also a big deal. Malaria in particular. And as we come to the end of the Marine experience on Guadalcanal, there's an interesting commentary that shows up about that. So both sides were suffering enormously, but the Americans, given our particular approach, our extraordinary valuation of human life, our willingness to commit huge resources to preserve a life, not just many lives. What we do in order to do that was something that was beyond the capacity or even the thinking of the Japanese. Way back when we started the lectures on the Pacific War, one of the things I mentioned were some of the philosophic elements that resonated among the Japanese people. And one of these was the way of the samurai. So that if you were in danger of being captured, you either took somebody with you who was going to kill you at the same time, or you killed yourself, you committed suicide. And death for the emperor was in a way a sort of martyrdom, right? This was an honor, something you would do. The Americans did not approach war that way. And as General Patton once phrased it, your job isn't to die for your country, it's to make that other poor dumb bastard die for his. Okay. I'll be happy to answer any other questions. Let's take a break, let you stretch your legs. We can turn the lights on for those of you who might want to look at the maps and get a little better idea of the perspective that's involved here. And I'll resume in about another 5 or 8 minutes. And any of you at home, if you wish to ask a question, you can just push on your space bar and I'll do what I can.
Yes, we have people who are ready to island.
It's something that's
Volunteers.
Really?
Yeah, I've been in Malaysia and going to canal,
Really?
waited in the streets.
Oh my
Push.
You gotta go beyond.
Struggled out, put on my face mask and going down and look in the cockpits of airplanes and they're still out there.
Really?
Out of the sea. Yeah, Coconut plantations, so staff. Headed by.
Window opens it and then
All stumps. Decades later.
I've always wondered what it would be like now, so, because with all the modernization, it's sometimes hard to put it in perspective, but there you are seeing it before it really becomes. Change.
The 70s, there was a lot of that. I don't know. Funny. They can go like that. Yeah, I still have that.
Yeah. Some of the transport hubs are still there.
Oh, yeah. It's fascinating how many airplane things were made. Shuttle and then they water.
You can take this developing.
Well,
So I didn't relate the piece. It takes 45 minutes to get.
Yeah.
in the 70s, there was still enough older people wandering back to see Victoria. I'm getting so going to the guest house, people come popping up, so to see that back when they were there. But the bullets were still being. I think it's interesting. It's such a marvelous movie. Yeah.
It's a lot of knowledge. Part of the world. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's,
Commander Ichi,
yes,
I would hope he had the good grace to die with his troops.
he did. No, he actually didn't die with, what he did was that when he went back, he burned the flag. And then he killed us.
Oh, I'm gonna say we Custer had the grace to think they killed him with the troops. Yeah, that was, tactically, that was.
Oh, no, I mean, it was just.
Charges, I mean, it's like.
Yeah.
I don't get that, right? But then we can.
Well, this is one of the things that I'll highlight a little bit of when we start up again, but it's important that.
Well, that's Japanese culture. In just 10 years, go from this samurai mentality, apparently, and then you know, some of the nice people.
No.
I don't get it. I really
70.
boggles my mind. And actually, when I was in Germany, well, one of the never saw any herrings. Well, it's weird. You know, you meet older, you know, vets, and they say, oh, yeah, Russian front. You know, once in a while, I remember one
I
guy
tried to imagine.
killed many Americans. It's like, well, let's leave this place.
Went into almost, it would still be minority of trees, but still standing.
You were war games, like
By our television.
my brother, that down
Stand.
over the match.
I know him, so that was it. Yes.
I know,
And you,
I recognize
it
them.
didn't take much imagination to realize.
It's like
You have the 4 or 5.
my brother, since we were kids. And he's got. I don't know,
Yeah.
hundreds, but not as active as he used to. Wearing and going. Remember, we used to go to this.
When I was 4, Christmas morning,
Yeah,
we go out to the Christmas tree.
Yeah.
There's 2 canisters under the, one for my brother who's almost 7. Come on. All right, before I look at it, I can't make anything out of it. I can't read it, so. put it down. My brother has his own. It's Custer's house. They're flats.
Okay. Cheryl, resume.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, you have the recording going?
Yes.
Yeah.
All righty, thank you.
And
All right,
plan.
this What we'll do is just kill the slides over here, or the slides over here, so we can see that a little better. And what I wanted to show here was the Battle of Cape Esperance ending this time with the Japanese losing a sunk heavy cruiser and one destroyer. The Americans just lost a destroyer. Roughly tactically sort of a draw, but again, operationally, the Japanese are turned back. And this again is part of that resurgence and importance of American sea power that is finally coming into play. Now, not to be outdone, the Japanese again plan another attack against the perimeter of Guadalcanal, and they launch a second attack again from the south. The defenses that the Americans have established on the Lunga River to the west and the Tenaro to the east are just too powerful to overcome. So they muster up a whole bunch of people. They've increased the number of troops on Guadalcanal to nearly 20,000. They have heavy artillery primarily on the west, which is going to be used to shell into the perimeter, which is still fairly well confined. It's not a big perimeter, which means that if you have heavy artillery on east and west, you can pretty much cover the whole of the American encampments. There's nothing safe there. But you're also going to bring down your surface ships again, and you're going to pound the daylights out of that perimeter. And you're going to concentrate your forces in order to penetrate the same kind of plan that they had before, only a little bit further to the east. And now with more troops, you're going to be able to break through that perimeter and recapture Henderson Field. The Japanese command structure is altered a little bit through this because of the defeats that the Army forces have suffered. They're not important to us in terms of any overall issue that's in front of us. Again, they organize in order to attack, and on the night of the 23rd, and they fight all the way through to the 26th, all right, just before the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands takes place. The Japanese again suffer mightily, and again they've attacked the ridge primarily, but they've tried to break through on either side. Again, they have some minor penetrations, but in terms of overall success, this time the fighting ends with the Japanese losing about 2,000. These are dead. So you figure there's a proportion that are wounded, and a good number of those are going to die by the time they get back to their encampments, particularly on the west. From this point on, basically the Americans on the island have now, in a sense, captured the initiative. They're not quite ready yet to launch any powerful land offensives. But the Japanese have now realized, finally, after nearly 3+ months, that the Americans are serious about holding on to Guadalcanal, and that Guadalcanal has now moved from a little island on the perimeter with a small airfield to something which now represents a real strategic threat. This change in understanding by the Japanese is now going to be a critical factor in what happens for the rest of this campaign. This is one of the reasons why I talk about Guadalcanal as really being a turning point, because now the Japanese are seeing something different. What they're seeing is they're no longer going to trounce the Americans and throw them back, and they're beginning to understand that if the Americans establish a powerful base on Guadalcanal, which eventually is built up to a powerful air base, that this is going to represent a real danger to them. And now they're going to still try to respond to it, but this last land attack, getting crushed as it was, tells the Japanese the initiative is changing and it's going to lie with the Americans. Now, they're not quite done with it, and there are going to be a lot more battles fought, particularly at sea, but it struck home. This is why I talk about the turning point issue. In this particular situation, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands takes place, and as you'll see here, the Japanese again bring down carriers, the Shikako, the Zuihu, and the Junyo. The Junyo is a smaller carrier again. The Enterprise, which had taken damage before, is now back in operation. The Hornet is there now, and the Saratoga is still getting repaired. It's not going to come back until November. So it's 2 American carriers against 3, but with Henderson Field, the number of aircraft that are available, it's still a very balanced engagement. But this time, in exchange for a damaged fleet carrier and a light carrier, that's all the Japanese lose. We lose the Hornet, and the Enterprise is damaged. Now, remember that I said the Wasp got sunk by a submarine torpedo. So when the Wasp goes down, all you have left is the Saratoga, which is undergoing repair and is finally getting back into the area of operations. We're down to 1 carrier.
Wow.
So again, from a pure naval perspective, when you look at Midway and say, oh, gee, you know, the Americans just sank 4 Japanese carriers, but we're down to 1, folks. And the Japanese are not finished. So it's important to keep this in mind as we look at this kind of balance as things go on. But now, again, even at sea, things are going to change. Why? There are a couple of reasons for it. One, obviously, American production's increasing considerably. Now, we still haven't got to the major fleet carriers that are going to be entering the fight and overwhelming the Japanese. But the other critical thing is that we're beginning to get aircraft which can contest with the Japanese with better armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, which means if you take a shot through your fuel tank, you're not going to blow up, which is something the Japanese did not have early in the war. And secondly, that our pilots are being recovered. The Japanese are losing pilots and airplanes. And more important than the airplane is the pilot. So as the Japanese lose things like this, their pilots often are crushed or lost in the process. They have less and less talented, capable, trained pilots to engage. And this will have a dramatic effect as we get into 43 and 44. I bring this guy up because Tanaka, in my view, is indeed one of the most successful Japanese admirals. He was responsible for bringing down reinforcement supplies to Guadalcanal and dropping them off, usually at night, then turning around, scooting back north again to get out of range of American aircraft so that he could load his supplies and transports. Now, when they come down earlier in the conflict, the Japanese destroyers can use smaller boats, if you will, to offload the troops and weapons and supplies that are needed and get them landed on the shore. But as this fighting progresses and more losses are taken, it becomes harder and harder for the Japanese to resupply the island. And indeed, it becomes so difficult that the Japanese themselves sometimes called it Starvation Island or the Island of Death. Because once you were there, you really had very little to sustain you. And yet they still fought on bitterly, and at many times, at least in tactical engagements, could defeat the Americans. trap them, ambush them, inflict casualties, drive them back. Tanaka was one of the more successful people, not just in bringing down supplies, but even when he was forced to engage Americans, he often came out ahead. And here's one example of that, the naval battle of Guadalcanal. And again, I show you these things not because any of us can follow this, unless you want to really study, but it goes to show you how chaotic nighttime fighting was constantly off the coast of Guadalcanal. So many ships were sunk in Sea Lark Channel and around Savo Island that it was called Iron Bottom Sound. And we'll see that when we get to the final statistics, if you will. This particular operation was that the Japanese, again, at this point, were not willing to say, we're going to get kicked out of Guadalcanal. We're going to still fight for it. We're going to try to take it. What changed was the strategic importance. So they built up their forces now to 30,000 troops. And again, they want to bring in more supplies, and the Americans are looking to intercept them. Again, this fighting takes place at close range. Why? Because the radar systems were still not operating at peak efficiency, and communications were still a problem. The Japanese still demonstrated through their techniques and their battle tactics a sort of level of superiority that could exist. What was happening, though, more and more was the Japanese were losing ships they couldn't replace, whereas we were able to start replacing. So this shows, in effect, the effect of this particular battle that takes place on November 13 to 14. And the Americans lose 5 ships sunk, 6 badly damaged, and 2 American admirals are killed, named Callahan and Scott. The Japanese still demonstrate that they are very, very good at night fighting. So what makes this actual fight seem to be almost a draw is that it took long enough that by the time the Japanese fleet under Mikawa, again, the person whose name you heard earlier, begins to withdraw, there are enough American planes with enough range on Henderson that they often catch some of the retreating Japanese ships, particularly those that had been damaged, and they were able to sink them. Now, in this particular fight, I'm just going to speak about one ship in particular, the cruiser Juno, which survived the night fighting, but was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. And on board the Juno were the 5 Sullivan brothers from one family, all on one ship, all killed together.
Oh my God.
Exactly. Can you imagine what that felt like? Partly as a response, the Americans decided that they would not let families serve together. They would separate them and move them around. For those of you who've seen Saving Private Ryan, you could see that that didn't necessarily guarantee that bad things weren't going to happen to an entire family. Saving Private Ryan was based on a real story, only instead the one who was thought to be killed, I think in Burma, or at least in the Pacific, actually was captured and survived the war, but his mother was told he was dead. Now,
They were from Buffalo.
Was it from Buffalo?
Conwan, right outside of Buffalo.
My goodness. Thank you, Robert. See, those kinds of details escape me, I have to say.
In the movie, they were from Iowa,
Right. that's-
which is a lot like Buffalo.
As a result of this particular fight, one of the things that the Japanese now understand is they don't have the time anymore to come in at night and offload in a standard fashion, offload their supplies and troops and weapons into smaller boats, which would then take them to shore. Sometimes a transport or a barge, if it made it that far, would simply be beached and left on the shore while it was empty. But it was pretty clear with improving American air power that the Japanese did not have the time anymore. So what did they do? They loaded up drums and they tossed them over the side of the destroyers and hoped that they would float into shore. Now, the expenditure there, the efficiency of that is pretty grim. But it was the best they could do under the circumstances. So even though a lot of those supplies never made it to shore, the point was that the Japanese were willing to take extraordinary steps, even at this stage, to say we're going to try to hold on to Guadalcanal. We're not yet willing to give it up. Yes.
With the ships that would be sunk, would they be able to rescue the people on the ship? Was that was that feasible? Did they?
For many, the Japanese surface ships that were coming in were very poorly set up to try to rescue, because rescue at night, of course, is very difficult. You're in the middle of a battle, shells are flying all over the place. You can't see where people are. You need to be slow in order to stop and let lifeboats down and try to get those guys. And if they were able to offload before the ship sank, if they had rafts or lifeboats, they have nowhere to go. So, they're just going to float around in the water. As daylight comes, you can't afford to have a surface ship anywhere near Guadalcanal if you're Japanese. So what do? You leave them. Now, for the Americans, since they're fighting close to their own shores, if you will, those could, during the day, could be rescued. Now, what do you do with the Japanese that you encounter en route? Histories don't talk a lot about that. There were certainly, and there are historical anecdotes about trying to rescue some Japanese who were floating around on various flotsam from the ship being sunk and so on. And some stories say that they would refuse to be rescued because that's comparable to surrender, and you're not supposed to do that. One could certainly understand, given how bitter this fighting is getting, both at sea and on land, that just say, well, good luck to you. Japan's about 3,000 miles to your north. Maybe you'll make it. You might land on an island where the natives feel that they've been mistreated by the Japanese, had their gardens, torn up in order to provide food, because the Japanese garrisons on some of these islands are starving as well. And that doesn't tend to engender a lot of friendliness. So there are also stories of Japanese being killed. Yes.
We had a friend of the family's, a doctor, and he was a naval doctor during the war, and he had seen attempted to rescue Japanese sailors, and they in turn killed the rescuers.
Yeah.
And he refused to treat any they did get. He wouldn't treat them, and that was a medical doctor, naval. That's a personal experience. I don't know how broad that was.
Well, I can't speak to the medical profession as a whole, certainly.
No, this is one man.
But in terms of the way the fighting occurred, the kinds of mutilation of bodies that were found, if you were out on patrol and you were attacked, and then you managed to, your survivors managed to get back, and then you went back and looked for the bodies of your comrades and found them mutilated, or things of this nature, it didn't engender a lot of compassion towards your opponent. There's also enough bitterness that occurs anyway because of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and you already have in your mind a sense of those SOBs can't be trusted. You know, there were times of attempting or pretending to surrender and then killing the guys to whom they were surrendering and so on and so forth, that it didn't engender a lot of compassion. So most of the time, there weren't a lot of prisoners. And we had learned about the Bataan Death March by now, which also didn't tend to engender a lot of friendly feelings towards the Japanese. People have described it as a race war, and I think there's legitimacy to that, but with a caveat. I alluded to this. I'm going to take just a minute just to go through this as a recapture, something I talked about in previous lectures. The Japanese attitude was that they were superior, and it didn't matter who you were. If you were not Japanese, you were by definition inferior. Their treatment of the Chinese is exemplified that, and we already knew that before the war even broke out, as far as we were concerned. In other words, before Pearl Harbor, we already knew how the Japanese treated indigenous populations, and it wasn't kindly. And they would use people for bayonet practice, you know, that kind of thing. It just didn't matter to them. So the idea that you're going to get into the kind of conflict with the Japanese, especially after Pearl Harbor, especially after, and I don't know how we learned this, the execution of the captured people at Wake Island, and then the treatment of Americans and Filipinos. The Filipinos took the brunt of it in the Bataan Death March and so on, just didn't engender nice feelings. And then in combat, which is already an extraordinary emotional and physical challenge, to watch these waves of soldiers coming at you, screaming and, you know, yelling and all the rest of this, you just aren't going to sit back and say, gee, you know, can we talk this over? You're going to kill them all. And then when you find some wounded and you think, okay, you know, Geneva Convention, fine, but we know Americans tended to have a humane approach to things. And then find that he's hiding a grenade and he blows up your best buddy. He's simply trying to get the guys some care. Or they walk out carrying a flag of surrender and then start killing you when you stand up to go accept their surrender. You're going to say, screw that. I want to go home. I don't want to stay out here. And if it means killing that guy, tough. That's what happens. So when you watch movies or different things, I think maybe one particular movie some of you may have seen called Hacksaw Ridge is worth watching, because in that there's an American, it's a wonderful story and it's a true story, right? It's absolutely true. Guy's name, last name was Doss, D-O-S-S, conscientious objector with the Marines. Takes place in Okinawa in 1945. He rescues some Japanese wounded soldiers, and because he's on a ridge and he has to lower them down for them to be taken to a facility. He apparently rescued 5 out of, plus all the Americans he rescued. None of those 5 Japanese made it to the medical facility. They all died en route from their wounds. All right, so what else happens? Well, again, just a couple of weeks later, after that battle, we have the Battle of Tessaferunga. And here, again, this is one of those things where Tanaka is bringing in supplies. he runs into an American force which is markedly superior to his, right? Several cruisers and destroyers against destroyers. Yet he inflicts considerable damage on the Americans with very little loss to himself. So the Northampton is a cruiser, for example. The Takanami is a destroyer. And others were damaged severely in the process. Again, the Japanese were not yet willing, even as late as November, in spite of not being able to muster another major land attack. They're not willing to give up the island. But they are beginning to see that the end is approaching. I mentioned that Callahan and Scott, I'm sorry about the way that got put in there. It's apparently not right. But one of the things I want to show here again is that, like the Chicago, the New Orleans took damage and had to sail backwards to Sydney Harbor. When we look at the distance between Guadalcanal and Sydney Harbor, that is a very long way. And then look at this though, sailing backwards to Puget Sound. That must have been a very boring trip, because you're not going very fast. But what this demonstrates is something extraordinary about the American way of war and our commitment or the commitment sailors have to their ship. The personification of what this ship means. We might think, well, you listen, it's just a bunch of steel. Why don't you just scrap it, tear it all apart, and recycle the steel and build a new one? These guys weren't about to give up a ship, even though it meant sailing thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean backwards. There's an attachment that you just can't give up. So like the Chicago, the New Orleans does basically the same thing. Now, I bring this up because it's particularly important to understand how there was a certain sense of balance if all we do is look at numbers. And I wanted to show this because it demonstrates something particularly important, and that is that the total Japanese aircraft losses as constituted in this table are almost exactly the same as they are for the Americans. Now, what does this mean? Well, you know, it's split, except that the Americans could replace their planes more quickly, and we preserved more pilots. So overall, the Japanese are losing not just airplanes, they're losing pilots. And that becomes very, very difficult to fix. What about the ships? 24 and 25. Now, these are just the warships, and it outlines various types that were lost. Notice, Americans lost 2 carriers to 1 Japanese. We lost 6 heavy cruisers to their 3. We lost 14 destroyers to their 11. But they did lose 2 battleships. Remember also that the battleships at the time were still being used aggressively. So much as, again, historians will often say Coral Sea being the first fight between 2 fleets that never saw each other, only used aircraft, and Midway very similarly, just aircraft against each other, not surface engagement. Battleships still had a vital role, and they were used consistently in those roles throughout the rest of the war, primarily as either blocking areas or pounding landing beaches or other areas. They retained a great importance. Well, so losing 2 to our none was fine. We had some damage, and they had to go back and get repaired. But nonetheless, the great discrepancy that you see is just among submarines. So if you take that part out, the Japanese actually lost fewer than we did in terms of warships. But the final cost was something else. When the Americans and the Japanese engaged at Tassafaronga, again, it looked as though the engagement at sea was always this back and forth teeter-totter. But as I mentioned before, the Americans no longer had to contest with a Japanese offensive against the perimeter. Vandegrift, after all of the time spent from August to December with those Marines stuck, there was no rotation in and out. Reinforcements could come in, but very few were leaving. Vandegrift is finally relieved by General Patch, and the Marines are finally taken out. And I had mentioned this earlier in the first half of this lecture. 1/3 of those leaving were designated as unfit for combat by medical personnel who examined. 1/3. When one looks at the issue of combat efficiency among land units, when you're down 1/3, you are combat inefficient. And yet, these guys, as they might have been, malnourished as they were, suffering all kinds of ancillary problems, hung on to the perimeter, but it also exemplifies why there was no great aggressive action offense that was being taken. These guys were worn down to nothing, and they needed to be withdrawn and allowed to rest and rebuild and get over all the sicknesses and so on. Patch built up his force, and I showed at the very beginning of these lectures where Mount Austin was. Mount Austin was to be one of the first major heights captured by the Americans when they landed in August. Here it is, December, we haven't captured it. Now we have fresh forces coming in. So our day one goal is finally taken in January. That's how tough the fighting was. And even then, the Japanese did not give up Mount Austin readily. It was, again, one of those things where the terrain and the aggressiveness on both sides, the willingness to fight and die if necessary, is something extraordinary. But over time, and over the next month, roughly, the Americans gradually were able to build up an offensive power force and begin to drive west. As we drove west, we had a number of different river crossings to occur. Had to get through those. We tried flanking maneuvers. We tried amphibious landings. There were a whole variety of different initiatives that were carried out. But over time, it still took weeks for us to push the Japanese back to the very end of Guadalcanal and finally force the Japanese high command to recognize that Guadalcanal was not going to fall to their control. That was an extraordinary kind of thing. The Japanese finally decided in January that it was necessary to abandon the island. Now, again, you've been taken through an enormous set of events, and you realize that in the context of this particular campaign, the Americans have been building up the airfield at Henderson. The surface fleets had engaged and were continuing to engage over months. There was a rough balance of loss among the two sides. How are the Japanese going to get out when you think the Americans are now compressing them into a small perimeter? The Japanese that are to get out have to have ships that come from a great distance. This isn't Dunkirk, right? You're not going across 20 miles of channel. You've got to be outside the range of American aircraft that are looking for you. The Japanese nonetheless are able to evacuate somewhere between 10 and 12,000 troops. The Americans, right up to the end, thought that the ships coming down were reinforcing Guadalcanal. That's how in our own mindset, we had not yet accepted that we had won. That's an important thing to remember. So it wasn't until February 8th, right? So August 7th, February 8th, that we finally realized we have won. The Japanese have left the island. It's now entirely ours.
We had broken the Japanese naval codes. Don't we realize a lot earlier from the kinds of communications that the Japanese are sending between the mainland and ships or ship to ship that we have won?
No, because that wasn't the way the Japanese looked at it. The Japanese were not willing to concede. It wasn't until the final decision that was even made at the highest levels at the very end of December, and they didn't let anybody know until January.
Okay.
So this is one of those mindset issues that becomes so critical when various military leaders will talk about what determines victory is forcing the enemy to your will, which means your enemy has to accept your dominance. And at least as far as Guadalcanal was concerned, it was the first time the Japanese had to accept that they had lost the island, that it was gone. They could not recover it. Now, there's an interesting two comments I want to make before we finish up this particular thing. The losses you see on this particular slide, and you'll see different numbers crop up at different places depending upon how things want to get categorized. So no table that you're going to look at is ever complete enough to give you the full picture of the kind of suffering that went on. But one of the important things I wanted to show, as is somewhat surprising, because we think of all the support and modern medical equipment and things of this sort that we're so used to nowadays. Among the Japanese, 19,200 dead, of which 8,500 were killed in combat. What? Disease still played a huge role. 1,000 captured. Over here, Americans 4 captured. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that Americans didn't give up or weren't captured. It just meant that you didn't find them. They were dead. 38 ships lost. Now, I talked about warships as roughly equal, but of course, merchant ships were a big part of losses as well, which explains part of the imbalance that you see here. And notice that the number of aircraft, again, seemed quite comparable, but within that context, we recovered more pilots than they did. And that meant their guys fell behind. Now, one of the comments I want to make is based on something a couple people said. At the conclusion of the Guadalcanal Campaign, but I also want to mention this. Fighting officially ended on February 8th. The last Japanese soldier did not surrender until October 27, 1947. There was one other Japanese soldier, I think on Guam, who didn't surrender until, what was it, in the 1970s or something. General Marshall. The resolute defense of these Marines and desperate gallantry of our naval forces marked the turning point of the Pacific. That's General Marshall, the turning point of the Pacific. Major General Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff. As to the turning point, it was at Guadalcanal. A lower level Japanese officer said, after Guadalcanal, We knew we could not win. We did not yet know we would lose. So to keep that in perspective, there's an interesting element to what transpires in this 6-month campaign. In addition, the other parts of this story that I haven't related and for which I do not have any particular slides is that the General MacArthur is in Australia. And he's working to try to build up forces which are going to eventually attack that southern flank of the Japanese perimeter, centered initially on Papua New Guinea. When I was talking about the Battle of the Coral Sea back in May of 42, when the Japanese were trying to come around the eastern end of Papua New Guinea and attack Port Moresby, which was on the southern coast of New Guinea. The Japanese, at the same time as they're engaging at Guadalcanal, even after the losses of Midway, have not given up the idea that they might take Port Moresby, at which they would have a wonderful airfield from which they could interdict the eastern coast of Australia. But they couldn't do it by sea. They had to do it by land. And that meant that from the north coast, a place called Buna, they were going to follow a track called the Kokoda Trail over the mountains of New Guinea, which were extremely rugged, and descend on Port Moresby and take it from the land side. They got surprisingly close to Port Moresby before they were thrown back. And MacArthur, again, as a credit to his, I'll call it just bravery. Some people would say it's just because he was an egomaniac. He actually went to Port Moresby and helped construct the defense there. He did not have a lot of supplies and support yet coming into Australia. So in terms of offensive action, supplies were being diverted to hang on to Guadalcanal and to build up our defenses in places like Fiji and Samoa and other islands along that route of supply, and to help protect the eastern coast of Australia and part of the northern coast, where the city of Darwin, with an important port and airfield, was located, which had actually been bombed by the Japanese. We weren't so much concerned the Japanese were going to invade Australia, though there was always that little bit of anxiety. But the point is that MacArthur did not have supplies or support to such a degree that he could do much more than just have a holding action on the southern coast of New Guinea. It wasn't until the Japanese quit on Guadalcanal that the other initiatives, the drive across the Central Pacific under Nimitz and the drive up north from Australia under MacArthur, could begin to get underway. But the point had come where the Japanese no longer were able to mount aggressive offensive action. They would fight desperately, but now they're purely on the defense. It's attributed to Yamamoto that he said, you know, I can run rampant for 6 months to a year. After that, all bets are off. And when you look at the extent to which the Japanese actually did okay, he was pretty correct in that, but he failed as he did, being in charge of the Guadalcanal Campaign and in charge of allocating resources to taking Port Moresby, as he was in charge of the Midway campaign. He failed to understand that the critical strategic initiative was shifting and to act accordingly. And in that regard, I think, while one could argue that it was simply the Americans who outproduced the Japanese, which clearly we did, I mean, considering everything involved. Yet there were strategic errors that were made. So the Americans, in setting up Operation Watchtower to take Guadalcanal, had made a specific, important strategic decision. We're going to take that island and we're going to hold it. And once we've held it and driven the Japanese out, from there, we're going to launch offensives up the Solomon Chain. The initial thought was initially to take Rabaul, which never really we had to take as it turned out. And we will begin our initiatives in the Central Pacific and we will get MacArthur underway. We were thinking strategically and long term. Now, the next set of lectures will encompass the Eastern Front again. And I hope next time to have George Cummings here with a little show and tell again. And I hope that those of you who are on Zoom will come, because it really is an extraordinary experience to actually handle some of the stuff that soldiers on both sides carried throughout the war. It just is a whole different thing from sitting here and just listening to me talk. I'll stick around for a bit if anyone has questions. I've ended a little bit early because I don't want to jump into the Eastern Front, which is, again, enormously complicated. But any questions, comments, criticisms, additional information you want to provide, I am more than happy to listen to. And thank you again for your attendance.
Thank you. Next week, we go from the heat to the cold.
You got that. Although the summers in Russia can be pretty warm.
I like Guadalcanal.
That's
Not quite.
not as humid, sir. Not malaria ridden, but very
So
good.
fighting continued in
Yeah.
this area
One
till
of
the end of the war,
that's
till we got
right.
invaded.
Up the Solomon Chain, there were some continued
Actually,
fighting.
by
Trying to remember,
one thing together. He was.
there were some places, I think the fighting continued right up to 1945, right up to the end. But I don't remember the specific islands that were involved.
Well, we saw a lot on, you know, when they do them on TV, the different islands and.
Well, when you get up further, you go up to Bougainville and others that are up that chain, the fighting up through there gets pretty intense.
Yeah.
And there were probably some remnant garrisons that hung out. But we just said the heck with them, you know, let them wither on the vine and die. Kind of things.
I just wanted to get the name of that movie.
It's HACK. And it's a fascinating story.
Oh, you said,
Fellow
it's so much harder to get it up.
He was
So you-
from- He was a conscientious objector, but he enlisted.
Yeah.
43.
But he basically said,
Close.
and it's not a shock, it's not.
He just said in that general area.
He said,
Not Guadalcanal.
I will not carry a right.
I think the planes were out of Guadalcanal.
Came close to being court-martialed for refusing orders. And he's, in many ways.
You gotta be down on his shoulder, remember?
And they're looking. Some Japanese guys, come at me, and I don't see him. What are you gonna do to stop it?
Oh, he was, you know, he was.
And, but there was a story that's absolutely. We have people like that. Who do what this guy.
Somehow the Japanese turned the US of
Really.
Thanks so much, Mike.
No.
And I think we ended up, we had our own. Measure. And that's how we shot.
And I've got to go down to that part of the war. And
Eight foot.
one of the things the Australians were really